All right. Welcome. This is going to be the review for Unit 10, the Human Body Systems Test. This is going to cover the brain, the blood and heart. It'll also cover the immune system as well as sexual reproduction in humans. I just want to say this is the last new content before the end of course exam, and you've made it. You've made it to the very end, and I'm proud of you. So let's have a nice, productive ending unit, and hopefully you'll enjoy what happens. So the first thing we're going to talk about is going to be the brain. Now, the brain, we are going to be, you could spend years studying the brain, but we are just going to study the most basic components of the brain because when it comes to your EOC, it's pretty limited on what they want you to know. So let's go ahead and start from the top. The parietal lobe, which appropriately is mostly the top of the brain. This is going to be the region of the brain that's used for sensory information. This helps you detect things like pain or the sensation of touch. And of course, that would be a major thing for us to have. That really helps a lot of information just kind of become part of your daily life. And it also kind of plays a role in helping you block out some of that information. You don't want to detect every single thing that's touching your body right now because it doesn't really help you in any regard. It just kind of take up, space in your brain and kind of make life weird and difficult. Occipital lobe. That's going to be the lobe that is primarily, actually, I don't know of another thing it does, but it's vision. Vision is super important to the survival of a species, and that's no exception for us. Nowadays, of course, people that can't see are, totally functional and they can survive in this world. But 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years ago, that may not have been true. So vision was imperative to survival. It helped you hunt, helped you gather, helped you just carry on, find a place to go. Next up, we have the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is pretty various, actually, in what it can do. First off, it helps form visual memories. And it's also associated with, we have some emotions that are kind of connected to this area. And yeah, when it comes to your test, I'm not going to ask you much more than that. Finally, we have the frontal lobe. This is probably the most interesting part of the brain because it's the part of the brain that you're using right now to understand a lot what's going on here. It's going to be your critical thinking skills. It's also going to be your personality, which is a nice thing to remember when it comes to the article that we read concerning the tale of a guy named Phineas Gage. You'll remember that. That's hard to forget. That's the guy who worked on the railroads and had a small explosion where a metal rod passed through the front of his skull and damaged a good chunk of his frontal lobe of his brain. And it totally changed his personality, but he was able to survive and seemed like a totally different person, but could totally survive. So frontal lobe, a very powerful, very important part of the body, and is capable of doing a lot of things. So just kind of running on the idea that there's more to the brain than just the four lobes. We've got the cerebrum. You'll remember me talking about the cerebrum, and when I first introduced it, I told you to simply close your eyes and imagine what a brain looks like. And that pink, wrinkly thing you're imagining was the cerebrum. This, of course, holds the four lobes, and it's going to be the largest portion of the brain. It is also going to be the area where we process information. Next up, we have the cerebellum. I know at a glance, cerebrum and cerebellum look very similar to each other, but I like to remember bell right here. Bells always have those things that hang in the bottom of them and they ring around, and that's the thing that actually hits the bell. And that's kind of true with the cerebellum. It kind of hangs on the bottom of the brain. So this is actually going to be used for a very interesting purpose. It's going to be used for balance as well as coordination. And it also is associated with one emotion known as fear. It's a pretty basic part of the body, and of course there can be issues with it. Damage to the back of the brain can cause not only vision loss but also really disorient a person, which could be pretty bad. Midbrain here, I don't like this. I kind of regret putting this here, but I'm gonna kind of scribble it out real quick. And I really should have written in brainstem. The brainstem kind of consists of the midbrain as well as like the medulla, as well as the pons. So brainstem, really not the midbrain, is going to be used for basic functions of the body. Some of those could be something like, oh yes, heart rate regulation. Also breathing. And some very interesting things like swallowing. And the gross one, vomiting. All of these are basic functions that should be carried out and regulated by a portion of the central nervous system. And if they weren't there, you wouldn't be able to survive. Like, you don't have to spend any time thinking about to breathe or thinking about, beating your heart. So this is wildly important. And that's why actually this is one of those very first things that form in an infant. Well, not an infant, but a fetus, an embryo. All mammals, all animals really start to develop these things very early. And then later on, they build up the cerebellum and cerebrum to really add the density and the complexity to your thoughts. So looking at a brain, I think it would be pretty easy to identify the four lobes. They've been colored in here. The front region, the blue region here, kind of gave you a hint there, was going to be the frontal lobe. And no surprise, it's in the front. Once again, contains personality traits. It's the largest lobe of the brain, and it takes up a lot of space, as you can see, nearly half, and it's all pretty unique to you. So that's good. This upper portion here, the yellow portion, kind of the crown of the head, that's going to be the parietal. And the green portion below it, that's going to be the temporal. The pink portion in the back here, that's going to be the occipital. And then I'm just going to kind of point out, those are the four lobes of the brain, but we did talk about three other things. And this bottom dangly portion, with all the straight lines on it, that's going to be the cerebellum. And we can also see there's like the brain stem here. That's kind of this item that's kind of tucked underneath here. That is going to be the brain stem. Yeah, and the midbrain is actually tucked up closer to the cerebrum, and we're kind of pointing right now probably at the pons, and the medulla hangs a little bit lower than that. This entire colored in region, all around here, is going to be the actual cerebrum. And just a fun little fact, if you really think about the outside surface layer, that whole surface, it's actually called the cerebral cortex. And that's actually where a lot of your thoughts actually occur. It happens on the outside of your brain because of the different kind of material, different kind of neurons that actually reside on the outside. And we kind of talked about those neurons and what makes them so different. So yeah, let's go ahead and move on. So this is a more of a broad question. What's the difference between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system? Well, I like to think in the center first, so I'm going to be a little selfish and think about the central nervous system first. The central nervous system is going to include two main things. That, of course, is going to be the brain, and it will also include the spinal cord. Now, the brain and the spinal cord have pretty much one main purpose, and that is to process information. That's literally the purpose of your brain. It processes information, helps you make decisions, is really your ability to think. It's hard to measure to some degree, but we do know, different areas of the brain activate during different activities, and we also know that the spinal cord is pretty much sharing a lot of those nerves that extend directly from the brain. So pretty cool. The next one we have is going to be the peripheral nervous system. This one's going to be, by the way, this one breaks down into many different divisions. There's like subsystems within this system, but just keeping it pretty generalized here, this is going to pretty much include all the other nerves in the body. And they will probably extend directly from the spinal cord, and they'll go everywhere. They'll go from that spinal cord all the way out to the tips of your fingers, all the way to the tips of your toes, and they are the ones that are going to be responsible for, they kind of take in or receive information. And I should also mention this because it will go back to one of the labs we talked about. This is where our reflex pathways mostly reside. Yeah, it's going to be in the peripheral nervous system. And we talked about how a reflex is basically the body's way of making a very fast action so the brain doesn't have to like slow down and think about doing something. Your body's just kind of ready built to always try to avoid that. And we talked about how there can be some anomalies, some oddities when it comes to those reflex pathways. That's why we did the reflex testing in our class, to see if there was anything we could notice like that. All right, let's move on. So the heart, the lungs, blood, I know that's a big, broad topic. It's really the entire cardiovascular system, and there's a lot to talk about here, so let's get going. We've got red blood cells. You will probably remember red blood cells. If you want to, you can remember that they're shortened as RBC. Red blood cells are pretty much just going to help carry around those gases from gas exchange. You'll remember that we use cell respiration inside of our lungs, essentially, and the rest of our body to use oxygen for energy, and one of the byproducts is going to be carbon dioxide. So red blood cells carry those two gases. They carry oxygen gas and CO2 gas around the body. So blood isn't just red stuff, and it's not just red blood cells. There's a lot of other components as well. And we talked a lot about these guys, white blood cells. White blood cells, of course, we really opened up a whole lot more when we talked about the immune system, and we'll talk more about it here in a second. But white blood cells are pretty much going to be the defense portion of your blood. They protect you from viruses and bacteria and fungi and pretty much anything that enters your body that it doesn't like. These are going to be the things that are sent out to destroy or attack or identify it. Platelets. Platelets are very, very small, very, very small cells, and they're designed to stop bleeding, internal bleeding particularly. And this works by basically, sorry, let me finish that. It basically works by forming like a net. If there's ever a breach in the in any of your capillaries or a blood vessel, if there's ever a break, these kind of form a net, and they kind of clump together so that the red blood cells, which are considerably larger, cannot fit through that net, and it prevents them from leaking out. So they're a good thing. We like them. And sometimes people can lack platelets, which means they bleed too easily. which could be a major concern, especially during surgery. Next up, we have plasma. Plasma is going to be the liquid portion of the blood. And this kind of makes sense. We know our bodies are made up of mostly water, and plasma is mostly going to be water. It'll also be a little bit of like salts. It's going to have a little bit of salt to keep osmotic pressure pretty much the same throughout, and it's going to contain some proteins. And then we got formed elements. These are going to be the literal, basic elements that we just kind of got to have part of our blood. In particular, you will know there is iron. If you ever had your blood taken, a lot of the times they do an iron test right there on the spot, and they try to make sure your iron levels are high enough, which kind of relates to hemoglobin, which we'll talk about soon. There's also things like calcium and potassium. You really don't need to know calcium and potassium on your test, but I would tell you iron is probably a pretty important portion of this. Also, I just want to point out to you, there are certain portions of this stuff, so you can see the golden color in our little test tube here. That's going to represent, I think, about 55% of your blood, and this is going to be your plasma. And then you can see this middle line, it's roughly about 1%. That's going to be your white blood cells, WBC. And then down here, about 45%. I know that looks like a 6, but that's a 5. That's going to be your red blood cells. And if I could, I would actually draw down here on the bottom, and that's where our formed elements would be. And yeah, that would be the basic components of your blood. So, and I bet you probably remember seeing a picture like that in one of our previous lessons. Next up, we have the heart and breathing being related to each other. You actually did a lab on this. We did the heart rate activity lab, and this is when I made some people who volunteered work out, and we tried to measure, what happens to their heart rate after they work out. Well, we know their heart rate goes up if you perform more activity, but also it's not such a stretch of logic to see if your heart rate goes up, your breathing rate goes up. So as heart rate increases, so does breathing rate. No surprise there. You will probably always notice that, and you probably noticed it since you were a little kid. As soon as your heart rate goes up, thump, 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 you start breathing harder and harder and harder. If you start running, you will breathe harder. Your heart will beat faster. It is just related to each other because the heart and the lungs are directly connected in a very short path, and they have to work together or we just don't work, period. How does blood flow in arteries and veins? I kind of like this because there's a little key to remember it. I like to think about arteries. Every time I see the word artery, I think of the word artillery. That's probably misspelled, but I don't really care. Artillery is going to be those large cannons that the military will use. And if you have giant cannons and you're in the military, the last thing you want to do is point them at yourself. So these always point away from the heart. Always, always, always. They point away from the heart. Blood flows away from the heart. Now, I'm not mentioning if it's oxygenated or deoxygenated. Arteries are generally speaking oxygenated blood, but that's not always true, so we don't like to say that. So it just simply means the blood flows away from the heart. And also structurally, we know they're a bit different. Arteries are much thicker. Veins thinner, but they have valves. So veins, what direction do they flow? Well, veins are very selfish, right? If I said you were very vain, you only think about yourself. So veins move blood toward the heart. And once again, my warning still stands. Veins are not always deoxygenated blood. They are sometimes oxygenated blood, especially when it comes to the pulmonary circuit. That's the blood that flows directly to the lungs and back. Next up, we have hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is going to be a portion of the red blood cell that actually tells us a hint right there that involves iron, and that iron actually helps bond oxygen and CO2 to the red blood cell. And this is really important because we want to be able to move those things around. This is why people with a low iron count can sometimes have some issues, and we're a little bit nervous because they may not be able to carry the oxygen the way they need to. This is also responsible for giving red coloring to your red blood cells, which is always important. Please remember, guys, you do not have blue blood. You have red blood. It's either a darker red or a very red, kind of like the red pen that I'm using today. Yeah, hemoglobin is always in your blood, so it should always be a shade of red. All right, moving on. All right, so continuing on, what is the structure of the heart? The structure of the heart is pretty simple. I'm going to draw you a very bad shaped heart. And once again, that's not what the actual heart looks like, but stick with me. I'm just going to label this super quick. We've got the right, we've got the left, we've got the right, and we've got the left. Now, once again, you should remember this, but just in case you don't, I know the directions seem a little bit backwards here, but stick with me. We have two upper chambers of the heart, the top portions. The top portions are called atria. Okay, and we have a right and a left. Now, if you look over here on my little heart drawing, you'll see the R and the L. And R stands for right and L stands for left, but you'll see, hey, that's not really left and right. That's because you're looking at another person's heart, and you're going to judge it based on their own perspective. So your left would be their right. That's why those numbers, those letters seem flipped over there. And then we also have two bottom portions of the heart. And those are going to be called ventricles. And really the atria are just kind of staging areas to drop blood down into the ventricles, and the ventricles are the strongest portions of the heart. Ventricles actually contain the strongest muscles in the heart, which have to be super strong because they push the blood out of the heart into either the lungs or into your entire body. And that one strong pump really has to be able to transport that blood a long distance and in a lot of directions. Pretty powerful stuff. So just keep in mind there are always 4 chambers in the human heart. Other organisms have other number of chambers, but for humans it's 4. Nice even number. So how does blood flow in the body? Now, I'm not going to try to make this as complicated as I could. I'm not going to break it down stage by stage so much, but I am going to tell you we always start with basically entering the heart. And actually we start in the right atria. So I'm just going to generalize and say we start off here in the heart, and then after that it's going to drop down from the right atrium down into the right ventricle, and that strong pump is going to push it out through the pulmonary artery, and that's going to take it to the lungs. And this is where gas exchange is going to occur. We're going to drop off carbon dioxide that our blood already has, and then we're going to pick up new fresh oxygen from the lungs, and then we're going to bring that blood back to the heart. Now, this is going to enter on the opposite side of the heart on the left atrium, and then it'll drop down and go into the left ventricle. The strongest pump is going to squeeze that blood out, carry it out through the heart, up through the aorta, which is the largest artery we have. Okay, remember how we said arteries always push blood away from the heart? And these arteries are going to get narrowed down into these things called arterioles, and eventually into the smallest blood vessels we have, which are called capillaries. And these are sometimes only one single red blood cell wide. and they basically supply the blood to your individual cells. They transport all the gases around for them, help move nutrients around. Very, very important. And these are also the ones that get damaged whenever you get a bruise. So you know your capillaries all too well. After that goes through your capillaries, they start to pick up carbon dioxide and got to bring that back to the lungs. So the capillaries will transport blood into these areas called veins. And then finally, once we're back through the veins, we'll return through the two largest ones called the superior and inferior vena cava, which basically brings it all the way back to the beginning, because we always recycle our blood and we bring it back and we enter the heart again. And then we just repeat the process forever and ever and ever until, you know, your heart doesn't feel like doing it anymore. So next question, how does exercise affect blood flow? Well, exercise, of course, means that we are going to increase our breathing. We are going to increase our heart rate, which is going to increase blood flow overall. You'll actually notice this. Your muscles will kind of swell up with a little extra blood because they're demanding more energy and they're going to need more oxygen to survive. This relates all the way back to cell respiration, which we talked about a while ago. And it also relates back to fermentation, which is pretty cool. Lactic acid fermentation, to be precise. So we're going to see an increase in blood flow. But how does atherosclerosis affect blood flow? What is atherosclerosis? Well, if you have a blood vessel, and typically you just want blood to flow through there unimpeded, just nice and smooth. But every once in a while, you know, we have, a few too many donuts in our diet, or, some greasy cheeseburgers. Either way around, we have a buildup of cholesterol, and we can build up this plaque stuff on the sides of our arteries. And this is going to squeeze our blood vessels to a more narrow point, which of course is going to increase what we call blood pressure. No fun, no good. This can lead to a chronic condition called hypertension. It can be very dangerous, and we have, of course, a lot of fears involved with heart attacks and strokes and aneurysms. So certainly something that you want to make sure you check on. That's why we actually check our blood pressure every time we go to a doctor, because they want to see if something like this is actually occurring. So good information there. All right, so after the heart, we moved on to the immune system, and we are looking for just some basic definitions, some basic ideas that we find here. We have non-specific and specific responses of the immune system. We can see that we have the specific responses here first. I think I want to start with non-specific, though. Let's go ahead and say what those two non-specifics are. You'll probably remember we said no matter what, every time you get sick, you always manage to have some of the same symptoms or signs. One of those, of course, is going to be a fever. It's like clockwork. You can start to feel not quite right, and then every single time you seem to feel it, we check, and sure enough, you've got an increase in temperature, which actually isn't the worst thing in the world, because we actually produce these things called interferons, which actually help prevent some of your other healthy cells from getting sick. We also see something called inflammation. Inflammation is going to be the reddening, the swelling, the puffiness that you might experience around certain areas. Imagine getting a cut, just on your elbow or something like that. Inflammation is going to occur. You're going to see it get sensitive. It's going to get pain. It's going to feel painful. But that's going to be an increase in fluid to that area to allow some of those white blood cells to flood the area, and blood vessels will actually dilate. They'll become more porous, and so these white blood cells can move in and out freely. So hopefully they can do their job of fighting off whatever might be there. So let's go back to the specific immune response. We have a few things, but namely, this is when we start producing those specialized white blood cells. So they're going to be T cells. We're also going to make these things called B cells. And it's a very intricate little system. We talked about these things called helper T cells, and they kind of go off and they help make more T cells, specialized T cells, natural killer cells. B cells go off, and these are going to be like dendritic cells, and they'll go off and they're just going to kind of activate the very particular response, very specific response to fighting off a pathogen that enters your body. So honestly, if you just kind of keep in mind, T cells and B cells are going to be activated so they can remember, or basically form memory cells, so we can fight off the disease again in the future, and hopefully we don't get sick with that disease again in the future. So that's the purpose. So what are common effective methods humans can use to stop the spread of disease? Well, a lot of this you've known since you've been a little kid, but overall, staying clean, and that could involve using chemicals. A common chemical we use for cleaning surfaces is like bleach. You could use, vinegar. You could use another kind of acid. You could use ammonia, and good old-fashioned heat will do the job as well. A lot of really small things like bacteria and viruses, they don't like hot stuff. This is actually why we cook our food and don't see as many foodborne illnesses from it after we do, because it just downright kills them, burns them all up. And of course, there's just kind of keeping with that clean theme. It could be sanitary habits. This could be simple things like washing your hands after you use the bathroom before handling food. It could also be, cleaning up after yourself, maybe after the bathroom, bathing fairly regularly. That could all be good stuff. And of course, like we just have disease control methods. This could include using vaccines or antibiotics. This could also be just in general, making sure you don't cough on people or sneeze on people, or removing yourself from a population if you are severely infectious. So all of those methods are pretty decent ideas to help stop the spread of disease, but I'm sure you can also think of many more kind of common sense responses to how you could stop people from getting sick from you. So we mentioned vaccines, but what exactly is a vaccine? You'll remember this idea of something called an antigen. We said the antigen was going to be a small molecule that's attached to the pathogen, the bad guy that enters your body. And this little pathogen is going to get destroyed by some of your white blood cells, and then they're going to take this little marker off of this pathogen that's called the antigen, which is actually short for antibody generator. And this antigen is basically going to be the message that's replicated and shared throughout your body, so your body remembers how to fight it off. Now, if we give you artificially the antigen, if we place it in the body, we force an immune response, and hopefully we form memory cells to prevent the illness in the future. I know I wrote a lot right there, and you probably don't have enough room, but deal with it. What do the mucous membranes do in the body? Well, you'll remember the mucous membranes. They're found kind of all over the place. They're found in your nose. They're found in your ears. They're found in your mouth. They're found in your excretory organs. They're pretty much found in every orifice in your body. Now, their purpose is really to catch and trap all the particles from really getting too deep into your body. And also, a lot of the times, these mucous membranes, they're going to be acidic. So if we have a bacterium that finds its way inside of you, that acidic environment would be very hostile, if not downright deadly, for them to survive there. Now, this is actually kind of a catch-22 because sometimes we do want things to enter the body, like sperm. We want those to survive, and yet they enter a very hostile environment where they could die pretty easily. So, moving on. I just kind of want to overview the major organs, the major anatomy pieces that we find for male and female reproductive systems. For the female side, we have the uterus. You're probably going to remember a lot of this, but the uterus is where the embryo develops. This is kind of the centerpiece of the entire female reproductive system. It's probably the largest organ, a part of it as well. We have the cervix. This is kind of the barrier. That's really the barrier between the vagina and the uterus, and it prevents things from getting inside. Like I mentioned earlier, sperm. We don't necessarily want them in there all the time, or bacteria or viruses or anything like that. But also, it prevents anything from coming out, especially during a pregnancy. We don't want a toe slipping out or something like that. Fallopian tube, this is where fertilization happens. It's also kind of the pathway from the ovary, and the ovaries produce the eggs. And really, they help the eggs mature and kind of release them through what we basically called ovulation. We have the vagina, that's both the entry and the exit of the reproductive system. And then we have the uterine lining. This is going to be pretty much it's also called the endometrium, by the way. This is going to be where, we'll say fertilize. It's really the blastocyst, but the fertilized egg attaches. I should also point out when a woman is experiencing her menstrual cycle and she's going through her flow phase, this would be that lining that is released. Now, on the male side of things, a bit more of a different method, right? Females spend a lot of time around 1 or 2 different eggs at a time, probably one per month, just trying to make sure it's set up perfectly for fertilization, and they're really kind of in control of what's happening there. Whereas males, they just go with a quantity over quality method, and they just make a ton of sperm. A lot of them not very well made in the first place. We have the testes, and their job is literally to do that, to produce sperm. We said it's made up of these little tiny tubules, and that's actually where they form. We have something called the epididymis. This is where the most mature sperm are stored. And then we have the vas deferens. This is going to be the tube. It's really a long tube that goes past glands in order to make semen. And one of those glands is going to be the prostate gland. There's actually the Cowper's gland and the seminal vesicle. They all do kind of their own thing, but they overall help produce semen. And the urethra is going to be the tube that's contained in the penis, and this is going to be the one that carries semen. And I'll actually mention urine as well. And you'll remember we said women have a urethra that's separate from their reproductive system. Men are either lucky or unlucky enough to have it pull double duty for them. And then, of course, the penis. This is going to house most of the urethra. And, of course, it's going to be the delivery method. It's going to be the launching point for these, hopefully for all the semen to find a nice, healthy, ready egg in the woman to make a person. Finally, we have what is the purpose of the testes and the ovaries? Well, pretty straightforward here. The testes, of course, they're going to be used for making sperm. They're also responsible for producing some hormones You'll probably remember something we talked about called testosterone, which is generally identified as the male hormone, but that doesn't mean women don't have it too. They do, and they actually require it. Ovaries are going to be responsible for making ova, or ovum for a singular, and they are helping us, well, not us, but females produce estrogen, which of course is going to be pretty important for the development of a baby, but also creating the secondary sexual characteristics of a woman herself. And then what are the gametes of males and females? Well, gametes, I'm really just trying to draw some knowledge out of you from a long time ago. Gametes are the sex cells. So what are the sex cells? Well, pretty simple. Once again, it is sperm for men, and for females, it's going to be the egg, or the ova, or ovum. So there you go. Pretty straightforward, I think. Now, what does the fetus use the umbilical cord, the placenta, and the amniotic sac for? You should remember the umbilical cord attaches to the basically where the navel or belly button of the child is, or the fetus is, and this is going to connect, mother, and we'll call it the fetus. And this is once again going to be severed after birth. We have the placenta. It's like an organ that helps exchange gases. As well as nutrients. It's kind of like a filter. We don't just want the mom's blood pumping into the baby, so we use the placenta to kind of act as like a filter to make sure the baby's blood kind of picks up the nutrients and gases from the mother's blood. And then we have the amniotic sac. This protects the developing fetus, namely from movement of the mother. Of course, she's not expected to just lay there. She's a living thing. She needs to move around, and the baby needs to be protected from it. So there's a fluid-filled sac. So whenever, as the mom's walking or something like that, the baby's not just bumping their head on the surface of her belly. Basically, the fluid allows them to kind of float around in a nice, safe place. So what are the names and patterns of development from a single cell to a whole human? Well, first off, of course, we have sperm, and we have the egg. And when they both meet in that process called fertilization, we make something, the first single cell, and that's going to be called a zygote. And you'll remember I joked around with you saying your very first name was Goat, and your first name even had a Z in it, so you're like the coolest person ever. So zygotes eventually go on, and they get called a blastocyst, or a blastocyte. But a blastocyst will eventually form a gastrula. We're not going to worry about that one, but this is going to be a hollow ball. So this is going to be one cell. This is going to be a collection of cells. It's going to be hollow. It's going to be a hollow ball of cells. This is going to be the thing that actually bonds with the uterine lining of the mother. And then that blastocyst will develop into what we call an embryo. And you'll stay in embryo for a few weeks. Your embryo is going to look a lot like other embryos of other kinds of animals, but it does start to separate. It starts to differentiate. Embryos have been known, to have the very tiny nubs kind of on their as their legs and their arms. So they also have that fully formed tail. You've started to form your notochord, maybe the formation of eyes, the basics of body structure, but not very much. Then you get to move on and you get to become a fetus, and you get to stay a fetus for a few months as you start to develop and really develop very quickly, and then finally, after birth, we get to call you a baby. Oh, so cute. So there we go. We start off from two cells, two gametes, sperm and egg, go through fertilization. That leads to one single new cell called a zygote. Your zygote quickly develops into a blastocyst, just a hollow ball of cells that implants to the uterine lining, and then you start to, set up camp, and you become the embryo for a few weeks, and then you get to move on to fetus, and you get to develop very rapidly, and then you get to become a baby. So when we're talking about the development of that fetus, let's go ahead and break this down. We said there are 3 trimesters, and it's pretty straightforward what really happens. The first trimester, of course, we're forming the basics of body structure. Right? That would be the arms, the legs, the head, the body. You're not just a blob anymore. You're not a undifferentiated ball of cells. Organs start to develop. This includes the heart, the very early formation of the brain. Of course, there's skin on the outside. And we start to, get the little beginnings of a liver, a little bit of a kidney. Pretty much all the organs start to develop. Now, they're not dense. There's not a whole lot to them, but that's pretty much what's going on there. By the end of trimester 1, hopefully you've graduated to the fetus stage, and we've sailed past embryo. We've sailed past blastocyst. Pretty cool stuff. Trimester 2, sorry. Trimester 2 is going to be a lot more rapid development. We're going to start to see fingers and toes form. You're going to start to see the formation of, of course, size is going to increase considerably. I think by the end of the stage, you should be 12 inches long, roundabouts. Now, you're going to be pretty large in size, but we haven't increased in density quite yet. We've kind of occupied the space, and then we're soon going to start rapidly developing that space. We start to see some movement, which means muscles have started to develop, the bone structures have started development, and that's going to be kind of generalized there. Trimester 3, honestly, this is just kind of the finishing touches. Of course, we're going to have we're going to start to see like hair form. We're going to see brain activity really increase. Babies start to see and hear. We even know they start to dream. It's pretty crazy stuff. And honestly, most babies, especially here in the United States, if you make it into trimester 3, as long as you're in decent shape, even if you're born early, you have a pretty good chance of survival. So trimester 3 is kind of a victory lap in a way. I'm not saying it's a guarantee, but I am saying the odds are much, much higher for survival. So that's a good thing. And once again, we break these down into trimesters. So this really is like weeks 0 through 12. This would pretty much be weeks 13 through 24, 25, and the final trimester is weeks 26 through about 38. But once again, like it's a little weird exactly when babies are born. They can vary. They can be a week early, they can be a week late. It varies a little bit. But there you go. We kind of covered that. And as a matter of fact, I think we got it all. So I want you to be confident. I want you to be happy with yourself. You did a great job. Thanks for following along. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I know I probably misspelled things, but I'm proud of who I am, and I can live with my own mistakes. If you got any questions, just let me know. You can email me. You can call me. You can walk in my classroom and just say, hey, man, I need more help, and I'll be more than happy to help you. So, have a good day, and good luck on your test.